My gut tells me that the best leaders are inwardly sound, meaning they're kind of okay with who they are in their own skin and they can take feedback, but they're also others focused. So, I think studies show that the top two qualities of any high-level leader are being both inwardly sound and others focused. Weirdly, less than 10% of leaders are inwardly sound, meaning they're okay with who they are, okay with getting feedback. And so I think what I see is that when you don't feel good about who you are and you feel like you can't be vulnerable with your team and be wrong, it causes a real challenge for the team. And I say this all the time, and I've been in a lot of rooms that are like this. High-level leaders, yeah, they need to be inwardly sound and others focused, but they need to be good listeners, right? Listening to understand their people, listening to understand the issues that are actually ensuing, what's causing it. And so you've probably been there, being in corporate world where you sit in a room full of leaders and it's really quiet. That's a problem. And I like to say it this way. If a leader finds himself surrounded by a lot of people with nothing to say, that's probably because they're not listening very well.
Welcome to today's Heart of the Hustle. I am here with Brandon Denmon, and I'm so excited to have you here.
I'm excited to be here.
So tell us a little bit about you.
Okay, well, I guess I'll start with just my backstory. I grew up here in DFW, and a town called Garland, which is just across town. It's a very industrial town, lots of manufacturing businesses, and that really isn't why I'm in manufacturing or why I've always been in manufacturing. But my story goes that, my folks got divorced when I was pretty young, third grade. And so, it kind of created the person that I am. And part of that is I spent a lot of time with my grandparents. My grandfather was a contractor. My grandmother, she actually worked at a rental place. They rented heavy equipment for contractors. I don't think I've told that part of the story in a long time. But because of that, I'm 8 years old. I'm learning to basically help my grandfather install roofs, build fence, install flooring. So consequently, when I got a little bit older, I ended up working in machine shops, cabinet shops, anything you could do to really build with your hands. And so, I learned an awful lot in my high school years working at these dirty factories, I'm going to call it. The main thing is that I learned a lot about bad bosses. And I tell the story a lot, and some people get offended because they were a boss in the 80s. But the truth is, in the 80s, the prevailing wisdom around leadership had to do more with straw boss mentality, telling people what to do, and not necessarily creating a space where people could find their part of the story. Until like my senior year, I ended up going to work at a place called Metro Store Fixtures. There was a guy there, the guy that owned the place, his name was Barry. Barry was a different kind of leader. And, it was the strangest thing. He'd walk the floor and people were talking to him. They wanted his opinion. They wanted his feedback. And when he walked away, they actually continued to work, which was different than a lot of the other places that I'd ever worked. So I just knew, if I ever grew up and worked and was a boss or a leader, that I was going to be more like Barry and less like some of these other leaders that I saw at that time. So fast forward a little bit, I spent a few years doing that and figured out that I wasn't going to be able to pay my bills. I wasn't going to be able to live the way I wanted to by working for Barry. So I took out a loan, got lucky enough to get into engineering school, met my wife within, seconds of getting to Texas Tech. Literally, we met 2 weeks after I moved there.
You met as a freshman in high school? Or a freshman in college?
Well, it's not exactly true. I did some college stuff, started in business and transferred to engineering, which is the opposite of what most people do. And I don't really tell that story a lot, but I didn't want to be an engineer because my dad was an engineer. And, going back to the whole story of divorce, you don't always want to be like your parents. I guess that was the brain that I had. So I ended up getting a degree in mechanical engineering. And I was gonna solve dirty business problems. That was the idea that I had. So my new wife and I, and she was pregnant, moved to North Carolina from Texas Tech. So we were out in West Texas. We moved just north of Charlotte, North Carolina, and went to work for a mom and pop owned shop, probably the largest family owned brick manufacturer in North America. I was there about 2 weeks, and the guy comes to me. His name was John Eisenhower, and John said, "Brandon, I got bad news. We didn't tell you. Not that we forgot to tell you. But we're selling the business." So here I am, 1,400 miles from home with my new pregnant wife and trying to figure out how in the world am I going to get back to Texas because I've made a huge mistake. And the truth is, the company that bought us, Boral, they were a blessing. They were very people and process focused. And more importantly, they had a culture, kind of like my friend Barry, going back to Metro store fixtures. By the way, we made cabinets for a place called Things Remembered. You may remember those when they had malls. Also, the Sunglass Hut. They might have had those glasses at Sunglass Hut. Anyhow, I spent the next almost 30 years doing M&A work with Boral, a lot of joint ventures, mostly turnarounds. You know, we were fixing up the businesses we bought and trying to instill not just the systems and processes, but the culture that we wanted to see in our operating units. About 3 years ago in October, we sold that business after a joint venture with private equity held group, Lone Star Funds here in Dallas, and we made a little money because it was a good sell. You know, when I left the business, I was a little confused, like, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? I just turned 50 years old, still a lot of energy, still a lot of love for the people and the business. And that's when I started Peak Executive Solutions to try and come alongside these small and middle market manufacturing businesses to create a space where their people could also find their part of the story in the business. And so that's when I created Peak Executive Solutions to help solve those problems that plague businesses around people, around process, around product management sometimes. And so that's the backstory. That's you know, sort of how I got where I am today.
Yeah. So you mentioned dirty businesses. I haven't heard that term before. So give me a definition of what that means.
It's probably not a good way to say it because we tried to keep them pretty clean, even though, you know, the core of what we did is mine dirt and turn it into right rectangular prisms that are pretty and build the homes of, you know, the American dream, right? A brick home, especially here in Texas. What I mean by dirty businesses that are more manual and operation, people are doing shoveling or doing manual labor and trying to bring robotics and automation and opportunities for them to lessen their load. And the funny thing is, like, I did engineering for maybe a year, and then I really was more focused on the people side and engineering the culture that we wanted to see that actually got the strategy done in our business.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things I admire as I've known you, we've talked, is that culture is so important. I think as we're talking more and more about AI and how radically things are going to change in the next few years, I think there's still that human element that's always going to need to be there, right? There's always going to have to be some heart-led leadership. And so I think some of what you're doing is really important from that perspective.
Yeah, AI definitely doesn't have the heart, but it can tell you some things to do. And I'll tell you now, like in my coaching business, I use AI for just, you know, I give AI my thoughts and it cleans up. You know, I'm a dirty business guy, right? Like I gotta clean up some of the words I'm going to use sometimes, and I might use some today that are colorful because there's no AI to help me. So sorry. And you know, I think it's true that it's about the communication, it's about the trust and the vulnerability that you create in your business. And AI is not going to create trust and vulnerability, right? And get people to all be pulling kind of in the same direction. So I do a lot of workshops for companies that are individually, you know, the senior leaders are individually quite smart, but not quite aligned behind their mission or their vision. And so creating a foundation of trust and of vulnerability open up. I think I might have even told you a story about a company I worked with recently. And, you know, about half of them were PhDs, very smart people. And individually, they said that their departments were blowing it out of the water. But collectively, the company wasn't making their plan. And so the question is, how does that happen, right? We've got a lot of individual contributors that are quite smart, PhDs. And somehow they're not aligned behind the bigger vision. And it was an exercise we did where we literally talked about how did we grow up? What are the hard things that we had to do? First job, how many kids in the family, things that we struggled with that they'd never done before. And the weirdest thing happened. There was actually tears in the room. And, you know, that actually kind of surprised me a little bit. But the rest of the day, there was just they were leaning into one another and getting aligned behind the things that they know they got to do and being a little more vulnerable around how do we help each other? How do we hold each other accountable? How do we have hard conversations if there's not enough trust. So understanding where people come from, how they grew up, whether they had a Barry in their life or not, it just opens up that level of trust where people can have hard conversations and know that people have their back, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, and I think vulnerability opens up community in a way that, it allows us to create real connection and real relationships, right? I mean, I talked about that in my TED Talk. Especially in corporate America, we don't take the time to do that, right? We don't take time to develop those connections and certainly don't want to be vulnerable. And I think especially people like me, so I'm a Gen Xer, right? Gen Xers, and I think we both are, right? Gen Xers and boomers, we were taught that like there's personal life on one side, there's business life on the other, and there's a big brick wall in between, and you shouldn't ever cross that line. And I think what Barrys of the world have taught us, right, and more evolved leadership is it's actually all one thing. If you're going to be truly vulnerable and truly authentic and truly have a heart-centered business, you have to be willing to take that wall down.
Well, authenticity, that's my word of the year, but it is true. And the interesting thing, I think, is that people that show up as themselves and when stress hits, you're going to be yourself regardless of what's going on around you. So if you show up authentically, at least people will know what to expect when shit hits the fan, right? If you don't show up authentically, your outburst and the things that you do that are probably more authentically you that you haven't shown before, people just stop talking. It's so much easier if people know what to expect when things aren't going well. And if you're not authentic, you probably bounce back and forth between the work you and the home you, and that's a challenge. It's also a mental challenge, right? It wears you down. It gives you that, it's cliche to say that a lot of people have burnout, but they do, and that's because they have perhaps two personalities, one home personality and one work personality. Balancing that's just too hard. So you understand why some people have to be that way, because maybe being authentic it's not good. But we can work on that too.
Maybe you're actually a really awful person and you shouldn't be yourself. No.
Yeah, I think two things get people off kilter. One is substance, right? And we see that, and it causes issues in families, sometimes at work, but it's also stress. So learning how to deal with stress when things are hard, having people that have each other's back, that know each other more than just on the work level. It's a culture of trust where you can talk about hard things, even personal things at work. Some people think that's wrong, but the teams that perform the best, they know each other fairly deeply, and they understand where each other's coming from, because you're not going to have your best day every day. Some days you get a ticket on the way to work or spill your coffee on your lap, or you're having a bad hair day. Not me, but somebody else. And that just happens, right? And so if you can just have that, know that you've got each other's back when you're not having your best day and pick each other, that's really what a team is about. I tell a story about the 1992 Dream Team, and it was really special to be able to tell this story to this high-performing team. We're talking PhDs, the smartest person in every room they've ever been in, authentically. But talking about Michael Jordan, Charles Barkley, Scottie Pippen, I can't remember who else was on it, but these were individually the best players in the world who came together and worked as a team. I think they won, their average win was 44 points or something crazy like that. Nothing's ever been done like that before or since. And they created a basketball movement in the world because of what they displayed. They were individually great, and as a team, they were even greater. You got some teams that are dysfunctional, and you have individuals that are dysfunctional too. Some teams, you've got a lot of great individual contributors that need to learn to work better together and create a culture where their people can find their part of the story as well, so the company can succeed.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things that I've seen change in leadership over the years is leaders who don't see themselves as the most important person in the room, right? It's kind of that upside down triangle. And I had a very similar leader that I worked with in my first big, my first big corporate job, right? I had a few before that, but my first real job. He was like, there's the pyramid. He's like, it's an inverse pyramid, right? I'm at the bottom and my job is to support everybody else above me.
Yeah.
Right. And all the S rolls downhill to me. Right. And that, ultimately the buck stops here. But I think there's a shift in leadership. Do you think that's a generational thing, or do you think it's a mindset thing? Do you think it's a cultural thing? Do you think it's just personality focused? Where's kind of the origin of that?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. My gut tells me that the best leaders are inwardly sound, meaning they're kind of okay with who they are in their own skin, and they can take feedback, but they're also others focused. So, I think studies show that the top two qualities of any high-level leader are being both inwardly sound and others focused. Weirdly, less than 10% of leaders are inwardly sound, meaning they're okay with who they are, okay with getting feedback. And so I think what I see is that when you have, I'm trying not to say short man syndrome, but I said it already. When you don't feel good about who you are and you feel like you can't be vulnerable with your team and be wrong, it causes a real challenge for the team. And I say this all the time, and I've been in a lot of rooms that are like this. High-level leaders, yeah, they need to be inwardly sound and others focused, but they need to be good listeners, right? Listening to understand their people, listening to understand the issues that are actually ensuing, what's causing it. And so you've probably been there, being in corporate world where you sit in a room full of leaders and it's really quiet. That's a problem. And I like to say it this way. If a leader finds himself surrounded by a lot of people with nothing to say, that's probably because they're not listening very well, right?
Or they're scared of you and they don't want to say anything because they're worried about your wrath.
Yeah.
I've been in those rooms too.
Yeah. I listened to a guy last week. It was probably a podcast, and he was talking about being at this Fortune 50 company, and there was 100 leaders in a room. It was a big conference or something like that, and it was a culture-focused discussion. And he had asked a question about something that about dysfunction, right? It's about trust, accountability. It's around having healthy conflict, if you will. And he asked, who's willing to be vulnerable enough to raise their hand and say what they believe the biggest dysfunction is in this team, right? And out of 100 top-level leaders, this includes the CEO, maybe the managing director, and a bunch of VPs as a guess, 2 people were willing to raise their hand. And it tells quite a story of something may be going on where you need to be able to create some trust if you're going to create momentum, to create culture, which actually can lead to getting your strategy executed with confidence. But otherwise, it's just whatever the guy at the top says, and everybody marches to that order. Feels like, sounds like military, but from my view, the military is learning to lead a lot better than that.
Yeah, I was thinking about, when you look at our school system and you look at the way that we are taught, right? It's all individual contributor. It's my grades, it's not our grades, right? You might start getting into group projects, right? Maybe middle school, my son's in middle school, high school in 2 more days. But we're not really taught. We're taught to be individual contributors. And so I think that's a shift that I've seen in business over the last, 20, 30 years is not hiring or not promoting individual contributors because they're very good at their job, but promoting people for their leadership skills, which often sometimes means they might not be as good of an individual contributor. So I'm curious about your perspective on that.
Yeah, well, I would like to think that's happening. I think businesses that do a good job of promoting the people that show good leadership traits and abilities above individual contributor tend to do better. I do believe that. But what I see in practice is that, and again, I'm very manufacturing focused, so there's a lot of individual contributor traits around maintenance mechanics, welders, people that, contribute well in the operations department, a running machine. And because they show up to work on time, they participate in meetings, they have a good voice, or they show some level of influence over the group, they get promoted. And maybe not wrongly, right? I mean, they probably do have the ability to become a leader. The issue I'm seeing more is that companies aren't doing as much work in that mid-level leaders of getting them trained, of getting them, the skills that they need to lead at a high level. So it's like, hey, you were a really good individual contributor. Now go over here and run this team. And the outcome is poor performance. And guess what? It's that leader's fault. Not true. It's really the upper management's fault, right? Because they don't necessarily recognize that because this person was a good welder, that they won't be a good head of maintenance. And so I see it a lot, and let's not call it an epidemic, because some people recognize it, but how do you get there, right? The new people get trained, right? When you're brand new, you know nothing, you get trained on the job, you get safety, quality, perhaps, other kinds of training, environmental training or whatever, depending on the type of business. The senior leaders also get training, right? They get some level of strategic planning, culture focus, and all these things. And the folks in the middle, it almost feels like a trap, right? You get promoted up, and until you get to that next level, you're just expected to do a really good job. And so it's a little bit of a challenge unless you're a natural leader. You've seen it exhibited, like my friend Barry, in some way where you say, maybe that's the way to do it. Let's experiment with that.
Yeah, having someone that you can emulate.
Yeah. I mean, just having a mentor, having a coach. Obviously I do executive coaching, I do frontline leadership coaching, and I find that executive leaders, as they were coming up, got a lot of coaching, a lot of help, a lot of training. And now we're not sending people away. It's almost like a pandemic of people shortage. And so how do you send people to training? How do you administer that in the new world where we're trying to run lean, we're dealing with tariffs or whatever we're dealing with at the time? There's always going to be something and an excuse not to give people what they need to lead at a high level. So.
And I think leadership training can't just happen. Like, it's not one of those like, hey, take this LinkedIn course on leadership, right? I mean, my greatest leadership lessons came from one-on-one, right? Like one-on-one coaching, right? Whether it was from a boss who was really good or emulating from somebody else. Or I remember I got to that place where I was a great individual contributor. You were talking about that, but I needed, there was like, you're not going to be able to run a team, maybe necessarily play well with others in the way you need to. I'm an only child and, being completely vulnerable. And so they were like, you need to learn how to build a team, how to work within a team. What does that look like, right? And so I actually went back to school, went to UT Austin. I did a certification in like executive leadership and then ended up getting a master's degree in leadership and organizational design because I found it so interesting. But there's just some basic things that they told me that I just didn't realize. But I was so lucky that I worked for a company that was very focused on leadership development, that really, that was like, you're really good at what you do, but we need, this is one place that you need to be able to grow. So are you seeing that companies are not willing to put that kind of leadership? They're more on like the day-to-day revenue generation versus, planning for the leaders of the future?
Willing's probably not the right word. I think they're willing. I think they want to. They see the value in it. They hear it. They see it. They smell it. They listen to podcasts about it. And they're like trying to self-implement. But everybody's got a job. Everybody's busy, right? How do you find the time? And I think that's the challenge, right? So one of the things I'm working on right now is a frontline leadership coaching so that it's more like on-the-job training, so that I show up and coach the group. And we do it section by section. Like, for example, this month, for one of the groups was on communication strategy between shifts. How do you pass off a shift so that you know what's going on without having to have all this paperwork, right? Without them having to leave their workspace for a whole day and then come back, what's the right word, drink from the fire hose and saying, what's the next step? So I think role play, some of these kind of things really where people can experience it and get feedback, get real-time feedback are going to be, kind of the wave of the future for coaching versus going to the, Fred Pryor seminars or something. I don't know if those are still a thing.
I don't even know who that is. Fred Pryor?
Yeah, they had day-long seminars, how to deal with difficult people. You probably saw them. We got flyers like, hey, for $1,500, you can go and spend 8 hours learning how to be the best leader of all time. I mean, good ideas, good stuff, but how do you put it into practice? And I think that's really, as coaches, as leaders, as mentors, we're going to have to come up with better ways to do it because people are busy. It's a long answer into, I think it's more about time than money. A lot of times it's like, how do I give up this group of supervisors for, a day or 3 days or a week to grow them in their leadership? So I think we got to be, we just got to be deliberate in how we deliver the training and the follow-up and give actionable things. People can take back to work. They can implement it immediately, get feedback, see change. I know it's a long answer, but it just feels like something's changing in the coaching and mentoring space, where it's not going to be about one-day seminars. It's going to be about ongoing coaching, ongoing leadership training that builds on itself.
Yeah, I feel like that even in my marketing mentorship business, right? And I actually don't offer like 1-day strategy sessions, at least at this point, because I felt like, okay, here's all the things you should do. Bye. And that's not where the real change happens. The real change happens is in doing that, setting the strategy, teaching the skills, but then in the ongoing, right? The people who have had the biggest transformation, some of them I've worked with for years. Sometimes it's just a 45-minute once a week. Hey, how's it going? What are you working on this week? Where are you stuck? What's going on? Like what tools can I teach you? What's the new thing that's happening? That's where the biggest change has happened. And even for me, and I had a woman in corporate America I worked with on a culture project, probably very similar to you, 2 giant companies, international companies combined together. How do we create a similar culture? And so I was working on the comms side of that, the communications and marketing side of it, as well as creating sort of a global brand for them. But one of the coach, right, who was helping us through the culture change initiative, she kind of took me under her wing and taught me a lot about how I represent myself in meetings, how much do I talk, how much shouldn't I talk, right? And I needed that one-on-one, right? I needed like literally her sometimes like putting her hand on my leg and being like, not now, right? Because I'm the girl who's like, me. I know the answer, right? And she would just look at me. She'd be like, extrovert problems, and yeah. And I was like, and indeed, but it was if I had gone to a class and they said, right, if you are an extrovert, be careful about how much you talk in meetings because you might be annoying other people. I wouldn't have taken that back in practicality to the actual meetings, right? I needed somebody who was willing to tell me the hard truth of being like, you got to take a sec. And it changed my whole life. It changed the way that I communicate with everyone in every level of my life because I just didn't know. But I wouldn't have gotten that out of a seminar. The only way I got it was because we were together a lot. And then I was like, tell me how I did. What did I do? How could I do better? But it's that ongoing coaching that I think is so important.
No, I love that. And like I had a similar, I'm also an extrovert. I have extrovert problems. And so I'll tell you a quick story. I had a boss. This wasn't I had an executive coach who told me similar things, but he didn't get to witness me inside of meetings. He got to hear me problems that I knew existed in what my boss told me sometimes. But I had this boss probably been 15 years ago. At this point, I was like a regional VP or something for one of the companies. And I had some counterparts who were more introverted, very smart, probably more experienced than me, but they were quiet, and there was a problem to solve. Well, I had an answer, and I'd raise my hand and I would talk. The guy's name was Keith. But what Keith told me one day is this, Brandon, in this meeting, I want you to be the last to speak. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, let the others, I won't use their name here, speak first. I said, they're not going to talk. He said, if you'll just wait, they might talk. And it was true. And so it was a great learning, kind of like yours, where I sat there, I sat on my hands and chewed gum or whatever I did to keep me from like going, come on, guys, you know the answer, just say it. Because they were waiting on me. They knew if they just sat there long enough, I'd answer the question. And so it was a good learning, in that way. I think we always need help. I remind people, like a lot of people, especially if they're CEOs, business owners, in their mind, they don't need help because they're really smart. They'll just figure it out. And the thing I like to remind them is, pro athletes have coaches for a reason. Michael Jordan, who is the best of all time in basketball, we talked about him earlier, had a coach who reminded him when he got tired to keep his hands up, to shuffle his feet, or whatever they tell him in basketball. I'm not that tall. So the point is, the best, most effective leaders, they tend to have coaches. And I'm not saying I was the best or most effective, but I had a coach for 10 years. It helped me so much to get out of my own way, to get out of my own head, and realize other people have a lot to say. And sometimes you got to get to the point of silence for them to be willing to speak up. They're comfortable with the silence, and I wasn't. So it was a good learning for me.
Yeah. I realized some of the most impactful leaders that I've worked with, and when I've been most impactful as a leader has been when I was willing to shut up, and when I was willing to say, okay, we're going to go around the table and I want everybody's opinion on this.
Yeah, that's great.
Because the extroverts are always going to take over. We're always going to take over because we just have the answer and we like to talk. And then it's always the quiet person who you go, all right, what do you think? Yeah. Sit in the silence. Let them speak, create an environment where they feel trusted and comfortable enough to speak. But they always have the best ideas every time.
You're saying the extroverts don't always have the best ideas?
We don't know what the hell we're talking about.
That's right. We're just talking.
We're just talking.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. One of the, like, because you said that, I think, it's important to remember for leadership teams, like think about the team I was talking about earlier. You've got some extroverts, you got some introverts. And as you make decisions as a team, sometimes the introverts just nod their head, right? Even though they don't necessarily agree. So I think getting people to verbalize that what their concerns are will help them get alignment. And so we work on that a lot in my businesses to help teams get the feedback, to open up, to force that conversation so that when you get to a final decision that everybody feels like they could buy in. And we know this, that unless people have the opportunity to have their say, they're not going to buy in. They might buy in like this, but they need to buy in like this, right? And so there's a key difference in the outcome of that for the team that they're going to take the communication to, right? Because introverts still have to go communicate with their team what the plan is, what the goal is, how we're going to get there, and get buy-in from them. So it's a great point. That's a great point you make.
Yeah, and it changes so much culturally too, right? Some cultures, it is not appropriate to give feedback to the boss in front of other people. Anything you say is always going to be seen as negative feedback, and your job is to never let your boss be seen in a negative light. And so they won't do it unless it's in private. So I've found that with a lot of Asian cultures, like they will give you the feedback in the hallway or in the restroom, in the restroom afterwards, right? But they will not give it in person because it's their job to always show loyalty to you, right? They'll tell you later, right? If you ask, right? And you make it real safe and you give them
I think that's interesting.
a lot of time. Yeah. And I think that's true, culturally, it's so different.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And you got to deal with that. Unfortunately, I think as a business gets larger, that becomes difficult because the team gets bigger. The smaller teams tend to figure it out, like how do we give feedback? How do we make it known that the boss can also be wrong from time to time? And the businesses that figure it out are going to move faster. That's it, right? If you have a 2-hour-long meeting, you don't get to the end and everybody's opinion's heard and you got to go do it behind closed doors, you're just going to move slow. And that's a fact. We can't afford to move slow. We need to move fast with alignment, with clarity, with focus. And how do you do that, right? Listen, if you're a boss and you can't take feedback, take this feedback because you can't stop it. Like, just get vulnerable with yourself. Admit you're not perfect. If you don't believe me, ask your wife, ask your husband. You're not perfect. And so figuring out how to take feedback and be vulnerable with your team is going to create momentum. It's going to create a culture where they feel like they own their piece and that they're aligned to you and they can make autonomous decisions that are going to move the business forward faster. That's just, that's my view. I could be wrong, but I'm probably not. Not in this case.
So how big are the companies that you work with?
Right now, the smallest company I work with is maybe around 20 people, around 6 million in revenue. And the largest right now, I think they have 120 employees and maybe 150 million in revenue. But I come out of a large business. We were roughly $1 billion business. And the larger business was a couple of billion. It varies. I've got experience working for almost startups. And I prefer working for businesses that are in that 30 to 50 million looking to grow. Like at that next stage of growth, what do we do? How do we get aligned? How do we create momentum to get to that next stage? So yeah, thanks for asking that.
Once you get bigger than that, then you're looking at going public. The problems change, right? The dynamics of the senior leadership change. I've seen that so much, the difference between public companies and private companies and the way that the leadership, right, is able to make decisions and move. And so, so most of the companies you work are more on the private or PE owned at least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like it. Yeah. Almost all, in fact, half of them are private equity right now, and the other are just, they're owned by the founder still. And at that next stage of growth, people are always, they're either looking to grow, scale, or sell. And so almost all the business I work with are in one of those categories. Nobody's really looking to stay stagnant or stay right where they are. Unless they're a solopreneur and they might say, listen, I got all the work I want to do. I'm making plenty of money, in which case they probably don't need my help.
Yeah, God bless.
Yeah.
Good for you.
Bless them. Yeah.
Okay, so you're like an extreme sports athlete. I see you as like carrying giant boulders up mountains and doing that type of thing. So tell us a little bit about that.
I probably would if I could lift them. No, well, I've always been an extreme sports person. Like when I was in high school, I rode rodeo. I rode bulls and bareback horses, which is crazy. I can't even believe I did it now. Although my wife would say I'd probably still do it if I was nimble enough and had the flexibility.
And weren't scared of breaking every bone in your body.
It's the recovery now that's the problem. Yeah, so I do lots of weird things like I do a sport called rucking. It's basically carrying heavy weight.
Oh, that's what I was thinking of, rucking
yeah.
when you,
Yeah. So last year...
But carrying heavy weight to do what? Like where?
Just be tough, like to prove you can. Like, so last year I did what they call the rim to rim to rim at the Grand Canyon. It's a 48-mile hike. I don't know if it's 10, 11,000 feet of climbing. All in one day. We just did it straight through. It took like 21 or 22 hours of straight hiking. So pretty interesting. I didn't carry a lot of weight. It was probably like 20 pounds. And this year I did a half marathon carrying, it was 45-pound pack, just to prove that I could. I do 100-mile mountain bike races. I got a 100-mile race coming up in October. So I'm out of shape right now, but just started training for that last weekend. So yeah, I do crazy stuff. But the main reason why I do it to prove that you can do hard things, right? When things get hard in business and life and with your kids, sometimes things get hard. I have a 27-year-old and a 23-year-old. Just know you can do hard things. Like you just got to push through. Your mind, your body is capable of doing so much more than you think you can. At hour number 20, walking through the Grand Canyon, it's midnight, the wind's blowing 35, 40 miles an hour, and you're on a sheer cliff, trying to stay focused and say, man, you can really do hard things. When things get hard, you think back to some of these things you did, and you're like, it isn't that bad. It isn't that bad. So that's why I do it. Also because the people you do it with are also pretty cool.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Although now I feel a little like, I'm going to Machu Picchu next week and it's like an 8-mile hike and I've been like training for like weeks because I'm completely petrified that I'm going to like, not be able to do it and
you can do it.
Feel like
what's your mantra? Get yourself a mantra. If you looked at my wrist and I don't have my glasses on, can you read it from there?
No.
It says embrace the suck. So, yeah. When you're at hour 20 and you're like, why am I so stupid to sign up for this? This is ridiculous. Like, what kind of idiot does this? You look down and you say, just embrace it. Like, embrace it. Like, these hard things are going to get you through something else. When you feel like giving up, don't give up. You got this. I need pictures. I've never gone to Machu Picchu. That sounds amazing.
It's really not that big of a hike. I mean, it's like you hike a couple miles and then then they like feed you, and then
Are you riding donkeys or something?
No, you walk like, and then they feed you lunch. And then they even said in the itinerary that like there's time for a nap I don't know where you nap. I guess just like wherever you are on the ground. And then you like walk again. So it's only 8 miles.
It's like 5 hours, maybe 4 hours, 3, something like that, maybe. Anyway, you get lunch in the middle. Don't eat too much.
Right. Yeah.
Take plenty of water.
Grand Canyon, that'll be next for
Okay.
sure.
Yeah. Here's my view of the Grand Canyon. Do it over 3 days, not one. Yeah. And then plan on camping, and, they have a nice restaurant there that we didn't stop at. We just kind of kept going, and, stop and smell the roses. We were humping it, just trying to get out. Snowy on one side, hot on the other. It was an interesting day.
But we can do hard things.
We can do hard things. Embrace the suck.
Yep. Thank you for being here.
Oh, I've really enjoyed it. Thanks.
So if anyone wants to find you and hire you to help their leadership teams, where can they find you?
Well, a bunch of places, but my website is www.peakexecutivesolutions.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, lots of information. I try to do something several times a week on LinkedIn just to give leadership and coaching and communications feedback on things you can do today to change your leadership. You can also find me at Denmon at peakexecutivesolutions.com. That's my email. Reach out and let's have a conversation.
Great. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.